Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Trail cameras are meant to capture wildlife, deer passing through, foxes on the hunt, maybe the occasional bear. But sometimes they catch things that move wrong, things that don't blink and stand too still. And if you're seeing it on your camera, it's probably already seen you. I had been hunting that same stretch of forest for years. Thick, pine-choked land not far from Grayling, Michigan. On a piece of private property that bordered a forgotten run of state land, where the trees grew too close together for easy navigation and the old game trails snaked between deadfalls and narrow clearings like quiet veins running through the undergrowth. That fall in 2015, something about the woods felt slightly off from the moment I arrived for the season. The silence had a different weight to it. And although I told myself it was just the early cold setting in or the recent rains dampening animal activity, I couldn't help but notice that the usual signs of movement, the familiar rubs, the tracks near the stream bed, even the distant rustle of deer bedding down, seemed strangely absent or displaced, as if the forest itself had shifted ever so slightly while no one was looking. Normally, I relied on years of memory and instinct to choose where to sit or scout. But that season, with the usual trails gone quiet and the signs inconsistent at best, I decided to rely more heavily on my old trail camera. A simple, infrared-triggered model I'd owned for years that took 5-frame bursts whenever it detected motion and had never once failed me. I mounted the camera to a young poplar tree about 4 feet from the ground, facing north along a narrow passageway just beyond an overgrown logging path that cut diagonally across the farthest edge of the property. A spot I'd always considered ideal, because the shape of the land naturally funneled animal movement through that clearing, particularly during the early morning hours when the light was still too faint to see without artificial help. It rained heavily the night after I set the camera. A steady, soaking kind of rain that lasted well past midnight and softened the earth beneath the trees, turning the forest floor into a damp, spongy surface that usually preserved every passing print, whether it belonged to a buck, a bear, or the occasional coyote. By the following morning, the rain had finally let up, and I hiked out early, breathing in the sharp, cold air and expecting to find some promising signs along the trail, especially given the soft conditions and recent lack of foot traffic on the property. I retrieved the memory card, saw a few sets of deer tracks nearby, though oddly shallow given how soft the ground still was, and returned home later that evening, thinking little of it at the time, beyond a quiet hope that I might have finally caught some activity on camera worth examining. That night, sometime just after dinner, when the house had gone quiet and the windows were dark with the kind of early fall night that creeps in fast and holds tight, I sat down at my kitchen table, loaded the memory card into the laptop, and began flipping through the captured images with a cup of lukewarm coffee beside me, expecting the usual suspects. A raccoon, maybe a fox, possibly a blurry outline of something too distant or too fast to properly identify. For the most part, that's exactly what I found. A few nocturnal visitors sniffing around the clearing, a deer just at the edge of the frame, and a shot of a possum frozen in the middle of the path as if it had heard something but hadn't yet decided whether to bolt or stay put. And then, as I moved to the next frame in the sequence, I stopped completely, my hand frozen on the mouse and my mind not quite able to process what I was seeing. Because unlike the others, which were familiar and harmless, this image was deeply, instinctively wrong in a way that bypassed logic and went straight to something much older and quieter inside me. The photo, marked with a timestamp of 3:17 a.m., showed what, at first glance, appeared to be a man standing directly in front of the trail camera. So close, in fact, that his figure took up most of the frame, framed by the dim silver light of the IR flash and positioned with such eerie precision that it looked as though he had intentionally placed himself in front of the lens for the exact purpose of being seen. He was incredibly tall, impossibly so, with a narrow frame that seemed stretched in unnatural ways, his shoulders sloping down as though his arms had been weighed with something heavy, or as if his limbs simply didn't follow the proportions of a normal human body. His hands, bare and pale, hung well past his waist, the fingertips hovering near the tops of his knees, and though his clothing might have once resembled everyday workwear, it had long since deteriorated into tatters, with long, jagged tears across the chest and sleeves that exposed skin too smooth and too colorless to look healthy or living. His feet, oddly enough, were bare as well, pale like the rest of him and planted firmly in the leaf-littered soil, toes partially obscured by damp leaves that had fallen in the night. But despite the soft earth and the fact that the rain had only recently stopped, there was no visible disturbance beneath him, no compression of the ground, no water displaced or dirt pressed down, where a man of that size should have left some mark of his presence. And then there was his face, which still makes my stomach tighten even as I recall it. Because unlike the rest of him, which looked distorted or decayed or even confused, the expression he wore was disturbingly clear. He was smiling. It wasn't a grin of amusement or nervousness, or even one of those too wide, toothy smiles people give when trying to look friendly on command. It was something far worse, something stretched and unnatural, a grotesque parody of a human expression that didn't seem to belong to the bones beneath it, as if his mouth had been forcibly pulled back at the corners and held there by some unseen force, revealing teeth that were both too perfect and too numerous, as though someone had sculpted the face from memory and gotten it just slightly, horrifically wrong. And his eyes, those are what I remember the most clearly, were wide open, round, and fixed and completely devoid of light. Not just dull, but a blank. With no catch of the infrared flash, no reflection, no sign of moisture or life. Only the unsettling flatness of something that could stare forever and never blink. What made it worse somehow was that the camera had only taken one single frame. The trail cam had been functioning properly. I confirmed it before and after. There were no lead-up shots of movement, no blurry half-shapes entering the frame, no sequence of departure. Just one photo in perfect focus, as though he had materialized out of the air, stood silently before the lens, and vanished before the next motion could register. And in that moment, sitting alone in the kitchen, staring at that still image glowing on my laptop screen, I remember feeling something I hadn't felt in the woods for a very long time. The deep, crawling certainty that I had seen something I wasn't meant to see. Something that didn't belong in that place or anywhere. I returned to the site the next morning out of sheer compulsion, needing to find some explanation, any explanation, even a footprint or some clue to prove to myself that it had been a prank or a mistake, or a trick of moisture and shadow. But the area beneath and around the camera was undisturbed, despite the soft soil and my own deliberate approach leaving clear signs behind me. The spot where the figure had stood, where his toes had pressed into the wet earth and his knees should have left a subtle bend in the leaves, was as clean as if no one had been there at all. I didn't speak to anyone about it at first, but after a day or two of that image turning over in my mind like a nail in a dryer drum, I brought a copy to the sheriff's department. I wasn't expecting much, just wanted someone else to see it, to confirm it was strange, even if they couldn't explain it. The deputy who met me looked at the photo without saying much, took a few notes, and stepped away to consult with someone in the back. When he returned, he handed me back the flash drive, said no formal report would be filed, and then, almost as an afterthought, mentioned quietly that mine wasn't the first photo like that they had seen over the years. Similar faces, similar expressions, similar times of night, but no real conclusions, and certainly no public statements. After that, I stopped hunting in that part of the property altogether, not out of fear exactly, but because the forest no longer felt familiar to me. It was no longer a place I understood. I couldn't sit in a blind without thinking about that grin, or the way those eyes had stared into the camera, or the impossibility of a moment captured without any evidence of approach or retreat. I kept the image stored away, but never posted it publicly. Others did somehow. Cropped versions appeared on message boards, grainy and stripped of context, dismissed as hoaxes or urban legends or sleep-deprived nonsense. And I let them believe that, because it was easier than trying to explain something I still don't understand. All I know is that something stood in front of my trail camera at 3:17 in the morning on a damp October night. Something that smiled with its whole face and stared with hollow eyes that refused to reflect even the faintest flicker of light, and that whatever it was, it came and left without sound, without trace, and without warning. And I haven't gone back since. We had been living in that house for just over 2 years by the time the first signs of trouble began. And although it had never been a place filled with warmth or light, we never felt uneasy in it. Not at first, anyway. The house had belonged to my grandfather, a plain and weathered structure tucked deep into the hills of eastern Kentucky, far from anything resembling a town, and surrounded on all sides by dense, whispering forest that grew thick enough to blot out the sky in places, and held the kind of silence that made you hear things that weren't there. When I lost my job in Lexington in the spring of 2016, it had seemed like a practical decision to move my family into the old place. Free shelter, open space for the kids, and a chance to figure things out while we tried to stretch what little money we had left. Denise, my wife, was hesitant at first, mostly because of how isolated the property was, miles from the nearest neighbor and even further from anything resembling a grocery store. But after a few months, we all settled into the slow rhythm of country life. And I think a part of us even started to enjoy the quiet. It wasn't until the beginning of October in 2018, just as the days were growing shorter and the trees had started shedding their color into thick piles of crackling leaves, that I noticed something strange, something that didn't belong in the peaceful routine we had carved out for ourselves. I was in the kitchen one night, sitting at the table with the lights turned low, trying to read a few chapters before bed while Denise cleaned up in the other room. And the kids were already asleep when I heard 3 sharp but oddly soft knocks coming from the back wall of the house. Taps that were just loud enough to make me freeze and tilt my head toward the sound, but not aggressive enough to cause panic. At first, I brushed it off as nothing more than a tree branch, or maybe an animal passing through, something completely ordinary that had no meaning. And I wouldn't have even remembered it, had the exact same thing not happened again the very next night. 3 evenly spaced knocks against the siding, in precisely the same location, just after the same time. I didn't mention it to Denise right away, partly because I didn't want to make her worry, and partly because I wasn't ready to admit that it unsettled me. But I started paying closer attention each night, waiting in the darkened living room with the lights off and the television volume turned low, listening for any repeat of the sound. Sure enough, the pattern continued. Always 3 knocks, always coming from somewhere around the rear of the house, and always arriving after dark, as though whatever, or whoever, was responsible had been waiting for the last light of day to vanish. As the nights wore on, the knocks started shifting locations. Sometimes they came from the windows, other times from the far side of the porch, and once from the corner of the house where the tool shed leaned against a line of heavy brush. But no matter where they came from, the sound always arrived in 3s. And it always came when the woods outside had gone still, and the stars above looked distant and wrong. Denise eventually heard it too. And when I asked her what she thought it might be, she said it could be some local teenagers sneaking through the woods and playing tricks, though I could tell from the way her eyes avoided mine that she didn't really believe that. Not deep down. I told her it didn't make sense for kids to come all the way out here just to knock on our windows and disappear without leaving footprints. And even if they did, it would have been nearly impossible to move through that thick of forest in the pitch-black night without making some kind of sound, or tripping one of the motion sensor lights I had installed by the back steps. There was a particular night that made everything shift for me, a moment that caused my stomach to go cold in a way that didn't fade even after I told myself I had imagined it. I was standing on the porch just after 11, shining my flashlight across the yard, sweeping it from one tree to the next, more out of habit than any real expectation of seeing something, when I caught the briefest glimpse of movement, low to the ground, fast and startlingly pale, just beyond the tree line where the brush thickened and the trail cameras didn't quite reach. By the time I jerked the light back, whatever I had seen was gone, but I was left with this sick, pulsing certainty that I hadn't been alone in the yard. I had a set of old trail cameras I used to use when hunting, still packed away in the shed with some tools and a rusted tackle box, and the very next morning, I set up 3 of them around the property. The first faced the winding gravel road that cut through the trees and led to the house. The second watched over the back porch, and the third I wedged between 2 trees, facing the thick brush near the tool shed where I'd seen that pale blur just the night before. The cameras were infrared, motion-triggered, and silent. I checked them every morning, going through the frames like a man looking for proof of something he doesn't really want to find. For the first 3 nights, the footage was uneventful. Occasional wind-blown branches, the skittering blur of a raccoon or a possum sniffing around near the garbage bins, and once a deer that paused long enough to stare directly at the camera lens before turning and disappearing into the woods. But on the 4th morning, as I sat at the table before sunrise with a mug of coffee and the laptop open in front of me, I found a still frame that made my hand stop halfway to my mouth and caused my chest to tighten like someone had reached into it and squeezed. The image had been captured at precisely 2:13 a.m. and showed 2 figures standing motionless at the edge of the trees just beyond the brush. At first glance, they looked like children. Small in frame, maybe 10 or 11 years old, standing side by side with their arms hanging stiffly at their sides and their faces angled slightly away from the camera. But the longer I stared at the picture, the more I realized that there was something profoundly wrong about the way they looked. Their skin was nearly white, almost glowing in the infrared spectrum, not like any natural pallor I'd ever seen. And their eyes caught the light in a way that reminded me of deer or raccoons. Bright and unnatural, too reflective for any human child. Neither figure had any visible hair. Not on their heads, not on their faces, and not even a hint of eyebrows or lashes. Their expressions were completely blank, not curious or frightened or confused the way a lost child might be, but instead flat and vacant, as though whatever stood in front of that lens was only mimicking the shape of a child. And not very well. 10 seconds later, the next frame showed nothing but empty forest again. Same trees, same brush, same patches of dead leaves, but no sign of the figures. The camera hadn't triggered again, and there were no tracks visible, no motion blur, and no evidence that anything had moved at all. If that had been the only image, it would have been enough to make me consider packing up right then. But it wasn't. Another camera, the one mounted above the back porch, had taken a frame at 3:07 a.m., almost an hour later. And this one showed something even more disturbing. It was a close-up of the lens itself, with a small, faint handprint smeared across the lower edge of the frame, as though someone had reached out and pressed damp skin against the camera. The hand was child-sized, but the fingers were too long, the spacing between them slightly off. And the impression left behind looked as if it had come from something not fully solid, like condensation and pressure had mixed to create just enough of a mark to be seen, but not explained. I showed the images to Denise that morning, and she stared at the screen for a long time without speaking, before quietly closing the laptop and walking to the sink, where she stood for several minutes, just running her hands under cold water. We didn't speak much that day, and when we finally did, it was only to agree that we should bring the footage to the sheriff's office, though I already knew in my gut that it wasn't going to change anything. The deputy we met with looked at the images, nodded uncomfortably, and said something about pranksters and digital manipulation. But I could tell he was only going through the motions, just trying to get us out of the building without admitting that what we had brought him didn't make sense. In the days that followed, the knocking didn't stop. It became more frequent and more insistent, sometimes coming from multiple sides of the house at once. And once, when I was walking down the hallway in the dark, I heard a knock at the attic window, a window that sat nearly 10 feet off the ground and hadn't been opened in years. Then came the morning when Ellie, our youngest, told Denise that she had seen the quiet kids standing outside her window during the night. She said they didn't talk, didn't move, didn't blink. They just stood there, watching her and smiling. Denise went pale when she heard that, and when she checked Ellie's bedroom window, she found faint smudge marks on the outside of the glass, as though something had leaned close enough to fog the pane with breath and press its face against it. That was the moment we stopped talking about what was happening and started packing our things. We left a few days later, didn't bother trying to sell the house or take the trail cameras with us. We just left, loaded the kids into the car, and drove to stay with my cousin near Winchester until we could find something permanent. A few weeks later, a reporter from the local paper reached out to me after hearing rumors, and though I didn't give him the full story, I did offer one truth that I felt I could say without choking on it. I told him that whatever they weren't kids, and they knew we were watching them just as clearly as we had known, deep down, that they were watching us. I haven't set foot back on that land since, and I don't plan to. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the wind presses softly against the windows, I still hear things I can't explain. Faint tapping sounds, spaced evenly apart, like something waiting patiently for acknowledgement. And in those moments, I remember the handprint, the blank faces, the way the wood swallowed up everything without a sound. And then, as always, comes silence. Back in October of 2011, during what would have been the second full week of our usual hunting season, I found myself deep in the woods of Iron County, located in the northern part of Wisconsin, along with 3 other men I had known and hunted with for years. All of us committed outdoorsmen who returned to the same remote stretch of public forest land each fall. The area we relied on wasn't marked by any formal signs or improved paths. It was a rugged, under-traveled region, thick with pine, spruce, and tamarack. And in certain parts, the forest floor was interrupted by sudden wet bogs or patches of standing water that could pull the boots off your feet if you weren't cautious about your footing. We favored that specific tract of land not because it was particularly hospitable, but precisely because it wasn't. Most other hunters avoided it due to how far you had to hike in and how little visibility you got once the canopy thickened and the ground dropped out beneath you. There were 4 of us in the group that year. Kevin, who had spent over a decade as a surveyor and knew how to read terrain better than anyone I'd met. Dave, who was quieter but methodical and preferred bow hunting over firearms. Brian, who was a bit younger than the rest of us, but no less serious about the woods. And myself. Someone who had grown up hunting with his father and had kept the habit going, even when life made it harder to carve out the time. That year, we had pooled together our money to purchase a modest but effective wireless trail cam network, consisting of 4 linked infrared cameras with motion trigger capability, which allowed us to monitor movement patterns in the woods without physically retrieving SD cards every day. Each camera could transmit short-range data to a receiver we kept at the cabin, and we arranged them to cover overlapping zones across a long, sloping piece of terrain that ran between 2 ridge lines. An ideal corridor for deer movement, with both elevation and concealment on either side. For the better part of a week, everything played out as we'd expected, and the cameras were doing their job, reliably transmitting images of the nocturnal comings and goings of deer, raccoons, and on 2 occasions, a sizable black bear that we suspected was nosing around one of the baited areas. We checked the receiver data each morning, just after sunrise, and on a few occasions, we hiked out to pull physical cards from the devices when the wireless sync failed to catch an entire sequence. Nothing in those early days of the hunt gave us any reason to be concerned, nor did anything suggest that we'd soon be facing an event that none of us would be able to explain, let alone forget. Everything changed on the morning of October 14th, when we made our usual early hike into the woods just as the sun was beginning to rise behind a low cover of gray clouds. The forest floor still damp from light rain that had fallen steadily throughout the night. As we made our way downhill toward the 3rd camera in the network, the one positioned near the gully where the slope dipped into a dense growth of young birch and cedar, we noticed from a distance that the device was no longer positioned the way we had mounted it. Upon closer inspection, it became clear that the mounting strap had been bent nearly sideways, as if someone had applied concentrated force to wrench it out of position. And the housing of the camera itself had suffered a deep, unnatural-looking crack across the top edge that didn't resemble damage from a fall or weather exposure. While we initially considered the possibility that a black bear or even a curious porcupine might have interfered with the unit during the night, it quickly became apparent that no animal had been responsible for what we were seeing, since there were no claw marks on the plastic housing, no fur snagged in the strap, and no prints, neither paw nor boot, in the soft, damp soil around the tree. What unsettled us more than the physical damage, however, was what we found inside the unit itself. The SD card, which should have been intact even if the casing was damaged, had been broken in half while still inserted in its slot. It wasn't loose, wasn't bent at an angle from improper removal, and hadn't been chewed by a rodent or chipped by pressure. It had been snapped down the middle, cleanly and deliberately, as if someone had taken the time to destroy it while it was still connected to the camera. None of us said much as we stood there staring at the ruined unit. And though Kevin eventually muttered something about vandalism, there was a weight to the silence that hung between us. None of us truly believed it had been caused by a person just stumbling upon the equipment in the middle of the night. After returning to the cabin that afternoon, we immediately pulled the synced footage from the remaining 3 cameras, hoping that one of the overlapping units might have caught a glimpse of what had happened in the hours before the damage occurred. Most of the clips were unremarkable. More deer, a possum, wind-blown leaves triggering false captures, until we reached a motion event logged at precisely 2:43 a.m. on the feed from camera 2, which had been mounted about 40 yards uphill from the damaged camera and had been synced to trigger if anything passed between the two. The clip began without much fanfare, showing the usual quiet, grainy forest under infrared, until motion was detected at the lower edge of the frame, where something appeared to be crawling out of the brush. At first, it was difficult to make out what we were seeing, as the shape was low to the ground and partially obscured by shadows and branches. But it quickly became clear that it was not an animal native to the region. The figure moved like a human might if they were attempting to crawl on their elbows and forearms while dragging their legs behind them. But the way its joints flexed and extended looked unnatural, as though the limbs were too long for the torso. And its movements had an uneven rhythm that suggested pain or dislocation, though it never hesitated or stopped advancing. Its body was pale and hairless under the infrared light, and the skin appeared blotched and stretched, with no evidence of fur, clothing, or any visible gear that would suggest it was a person wearing a suit or costume. The back arched in strange ways, and the shoulders jutted up and down as it moved forward through the leaves. After approximately 15 seconds of slow crawling, the figure reached the base of a nearby tree and began to rise. What we saw next caused all of us to lean closer to the monitor, unconsciously holding our breath, because it stood up not with the shaky effort of a wounded animal, but with a controlled, deliberate posture, lifting itself in slow increments until it was upright on 2 feet. The figure was tall, easily over 6 feet. And though it had the general frame of a human being, it lacked any of the basic facial features we would expect. Its head was smooth and elongated, the skin pulled tight over what looked like bone, and where the eyes should have been, there were 2 reflective orbs spaced far wider apart than normal, both catching the infrared flash in a way we had never seen before. Unlike the greenish-yellow eye shine of a deer or the bright pinpoint reflection from a raccoon or bear, these eyes reflected a solid, flat, white glare, mirror-like, with no depth, no iris, and no movement, like they were made of polished metal or glass rather than any organic material. Most disturbing of all, the face had no mouth, no nose, and no folds or creases to suggest that anything lay beneath the skin. It was just a blank surface, disturbingly expressionless, pointed directly at the lens. For the next few seconds, the figure remained still, holding its gaze at the camera with such precise alignment that it felt as though it was aware of exactly what it was looking at. And then, without warning, the feed glitched. The screen flashed with digital interference, and the signal dropped entirely. When we checked the system logs, we saw that camera 3, the damaged unit we had found that morning, had gone offline just under 30 seconds after that last frame was recorded. We played the footage back several times, each of us hoping, maybe even expecting, that we had missed something logical or benign. But no amount of rewatching changed what was on the screen. There were no additional clips. None of the other cameras picked up any trace of the figure arriving or leaving. There were no return pings, no follow-up movement triggers, and no indication that the thing had circled back or left tracks anywhere else in the system. We quietly discussed the possibility of someone playing a prank, perhaps an elaborate hoax staged by a person in a bodysuit. But every theory we came up with fell apart as soon as we asked the next question. Who would hike several miles into dense, wet terrain in total darkness, wearing no gear, carrying no light, and somehow avoid triggering any of the other 3 cameras? Why would they destroy the SD card? And more importantly, how could they move like that? We stayed one more night in the cabin, but none of us slept soundly. Kevin sat up with his firearm resting in his lap. Brian refused to go anywhere alone. And sometime just before dawn, he told us he thought he saw something pale shift between 2 tree trunks at the edge of the clearing. He didn't go outside to check, and none of us asked him to. By midday, we had packed everything and were already headed down the forest road. We didn't bother finishing the season. In the years that followed, none of us returned to that section of Iron County. And whenever the story comes up between the 4 of us, it's always spoken about in the same careful, uncertain tone. Not because we're afraid to admit what we saw, but because we still don't know how to make sense of it. We never sent the footage to any public site. And though Kevin still keeps a backup of the corrupted file, it serves more as a reminder than as evidence. It's not about proving anything to anyone. It's about remembering what we saw, that moment when something unknown stepped out of the dark and looked straight into the lens of our camera. Not like an animal caught off guard, but like something aware it was being watched, and not at all concerned by it. That's what stays with me after all these years. Not just that it was there, but that it seemed to know we were there too. We had been living in that modest, weathered house on the edge of the Willamette National Forest for nearly 8 years when the events unfolded. And in the beginning, it had truly seemed like the kind of place where a family could settle into a quiet and contented life, far removed from the noise and clamor of the city, surrounded by nothing but trees and the gentle murmur of the creek somewhere beyond the dense pines, with the smell of wood smoke hanging in the air, and the children's laughter echoing off the hills as they played in the yard until dusk. That ordinary peace, which we had come to take for granted, was precisely what made what followed so deeply unsettling and difficult to explain. Because the first signs that something was wrong were so subtle and quiet that at first they were easy enough to dismiss in the daylight, even though at night they settled into our minds like a weight we couldn't quite shake off. It began late in September on a damp night when the fog rolled low over the trees. And though it was long after the children had been put to bed and the lights were out, I lay awake, and heard what I thought at first was nothing more than a fox crying somewhere in the distance. A thin, high, almost playful sound that rose and fell, just faint enough that I questioned whether I had heard anything at all, until it came again. Softer this time, but closer, slipping between the trees just beyond the yard, like the sound of a child laughing in the dark. I remember lying there, straining my ears, telling myself that it was only the wind and that there was nothing to worry about. But even then, something about it, the way it stopped so abruptly and the silence that followed, unsettled me in a way I could not quite put into words, though I said nothing about it the next morning, convincing myself it was nothing. In the days that followed, however, the noises continued, and each time they seemed to come a little closer to the house, joined by other odd disturbances, a faint, rhythmic tapping that came from the windows, too deliberate to be mistaken for branches swaying in the wind, and the soft, dragging sound of something brushing against the siding just below the bedroom windows, as though someone, or something, was circling the house, making its presence known in a quiet but insistent way. One morning after a particularly heavy rainstorm, when the ground outside was still thick with mud and the grass was heavy with dew, I stepped out to fetch wood from the pile and stopped abruptly on the porch, staring down at the wet earth, because there, just beyond the first step, was a series of small footprints, barefoot and impossibly delicate, pressed clearly into the mud, each toe distinct, leading straight toward the house. I remember crouching down and tracing one of the prints with my finger, feeling the cold impression of it beneath my hand, and realizing with a rising discomfort that they were far too small to have been made by either of our own children, both of whom had still been asleep in their beds when the rain fell, and that the tracks continued just a few feet into the yard before ending suddenly in the open grass, as though the person who left them had simply vanished into the air. For a while, we told ourselves there had to be an explanation, but it became harder to believe that as time went on, especially once the dog began to cower by the back door every evening at dusk, refusing to step outside even when coaxed. His ears flattened and his body rigid as though he could sense something that we could not. And on nights when the fog rolled thick through the trees, I would stand at the kitchen window and watch the gate at the back of the yard, which I made a point of latching securely every evening, standing wide open by morning, swinging gently in the mist. I bought a trail camera one evening after the children were in bed, telling myself it would put an end to my imagination. And the next day, I mounted it to a sturdy post at the edge of the yard, angling it toward the forest, where the fog always seemed to settle the thickest, setting it to capture every motion that passed through its frame, and feeling almost foolish as I walked back into the house, brushing the mud from my hands, and trying not to think about the way the air felt colder there by the trees. When I rose just after dawn the next morning, the fog outside was so heavy it clung in great curling ropes between the trees and hung low enough to obscure the yard almost completely. And I pulled on my boots and went out to retrieve the SD card from the camera, noticing how still everything felt. The kind of stillness that presses against your ears, making even your own footsteps sound too loud. Before returning to the kitchen table to load the images onto my computer. The first few images were uneventful, showing nothing more than the faint outlines of trees half lost in mist, the blur of a raccoon shuffling past, a rabbit caught mid-leap, its fur flashing white, before vanishing again into the fog. and for a moment I felt almost relieved. Until I reached the series of images stamped with the time 4:17 a.m., and everything in the room seemed to go silent around me. She appeared first as a faint shape at the far edge of the yard. A little girl standing barefoot in the fog, her head slightly bowed, her long white nightgown clinging to her thin frame, as though it too was heavy with damp, and her hair falling loose around her face in dark, wet strands. Her skin so pale, it seemed almost to glow faintly in the flash of the camera, though there was an odd bluish tint to it that the flash could not explain. In the next frame, she had stepped closer, her small figure now clearly visible through the fog, her head tilted back slightly, her face angled toward the sky as though watching something no one else could see. And though her arms hung loosely at her sides, there was something rigid in the way she carried herself, as though each step required some grim determination. It was not until the third image that I truly felt the chills sink deep into me, because by then she was close enough that the details of her face were clearer, and where her eyes should have been, there was only darkness, not the usual glint of light in a pupil, not even the faint reflection of the flash, but two perfect, unbroken black voids, round and featureless and impossibly deep, giving her the appearance of something not fully alive, yet unmistakably present. Frame after frame, she continued forward, each photograph capturing her just a few feet closer, her gaze never shifting from whatever it was she stared at above her. Until at last, the final image froze her inches from the lens. Her hands lifted as though to press against it, her fingers pale and splayed and pressed faintly to the glass. Her mouth opened impossibly wide in what appeared to be a scream, though no sound had been heard at the time the picture was taken. And the silence of that moment seemed to echo louder than any noise ever could. Later that morning, the photographs were carried to the sheriff's office, though the visit provided no real answers, as no record of any missing child matching her description existed anywhere in the county. And when the deputy came out to the house to examine the yard himself, he found nothing to suggest anyone had walked through. No footprints in the mud, no broken blades of grass, nothing but the heavy fog curling at the edge of the trees. After that, nights became longer and heavier in that house. The curtains drawn tight before dusk, and the locks checked and rechecked, though nothing seemed enough to keep the strange feeling at bay. And one evening, a few weeks later, the youngest child began refusing to sleep in his own room, saying in a faint and terrified whisper that he had woken in the night to find her standing outside his window, her pale face pressed to the glass, smiling at him with a mouth far too wide for her small frame. It was not long after that we decided we could not stay any longer, and before the year was out, we packed everything we could carry into a moving van and left the house behind, leaving the trail camera still nailed to its post at the edge of the yard, its unblinking eye staring into the fog long after we were gone. On the long drive away, though I tried not to look back, there was a moment, just the briefest flicker as I caught sight of the rearview mirror, when it seemed there was something faint and white standing at the very edge of the trees, perfectly still, watching the road until it disappeared. No one ever discovered who she was or what she had been doing there. And even now, years later, on nights when the fog gathers thick outside the window and the air feels heavy and damp, there are times when the memory of her comes rushing back, and it seems almost possible that she is still out there somewhere, waiting at the edge of the trees, smiling faintly and pressing her pale fingers to the glass.